This series of videos will introduce you to the topic of biodiversity. Some overall learning objectives is that you'll be able to define the term biodiversity and then identify levels of biological organization and provide examples of diversity at each of these levels. To be able to quantify biodiversity at the community level using species richness and species evenness, as well as explain why genetic diversity is important in a population. So the big question in the first learning objective is, what is biodiversity? So in anything with science, it is a good idea to try to break down the name first. And this doesn't always work because some things are named sort of idiosyncratically where it doesn't really make sense. But here, this is your big key. We can look at the term diversity and have an understanding of what that means. Differences, variety. And then bio means life. So a definition for biodiversity from the old textbook we used to use is the variety of life across all levels of biological organization. And that in itself is maybe a bit ambiguous for people who are not science majors. Even for some science majors, they might be confused. So life has this hierarchical organization where we can group them into like categories, I guess, and then those categories tend to be nested within each other, like Russian nesting dolls. And you probably have learned, maybe you didn't learn the domain part. When I was in high school biology, I had to come up with an acronym to remember this organizational system that we use. It's I believe, the Linnaean system of taxonomy. So now there are domains. There's kingdoms. If we're thinking domain, you're thinking bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, these huge groups that encompass large numbers of organisms. Kingdoms get more specific. Phyla get more specific still. We have classes, orders, families, genera, and species. So the species is our sort of most specific level of organization. And species exist within genera, so many species could belong to the same genus, many genera could belong to the same family, many families to the same order. So we get increasingly specific. We narrow it down as we work down this list. And the way that I remembered it was koala poop can offer fairly good sustenance, but there are many different kind of mnemonics for how to remember this. You don't need to memorize it, but this is just one of the ways we look at biological organization, but there are others. So here is a sort of broad scale way to look at biological organization. We can look at the ecosystem level, and even within the ecosystem, if we're looking at biodiversity, we're still going to be looking at communities, so interacting groups of different species in that ecosystem. Though there is diversity in ecosystems, there's a lot of abiotic diversity that wouldn't necessarily fall under the biodiversity component. So let's look at some different ecosystems in California. California can have alpine ecosystems, and so there are many abiotic factors here that are selecting for very specific biotic communities, things that can tolerate maybe a low oxygen content in the air or very extremely cold temperatures, so and also rocky soils, right? So who can survive in this environment? That is going to be a specific community of organisms. They'll be very different from the community of organisms that could survive in our coastal forests, which will be very different from the organisms that could survive in our kelp forests just off the coast. Or if we go down to the southern part of the state, in the Joshua Tree woodlands, where you get extreme fluctuation in temperature, high exposure, and not a lot of places to hide. Contrast that to areas of California where you might see an oak woodland or these kind of grassy savanna-like areas where there are these large sprawling trees that kind of form little islands, and they produce acorns, a big source of food, but they're spaced apart from each other, and then you have this long summer drought dry season. And then we can contrast that to chaparral, which is even more intense, where we get these hard scrabble plants that live on tough rocky soils, not a lot of nutrients for them to get to, high fire instances in these environments, and really exposed again. And then here on the coast, we have the dunes, which have their own difficulties that select for different types of organisms, like our dune mat communities that are great at adapting to that flow of sand across an area and being able to either reproduce asexually and make sure more of you survive as the sand moves, or to maybe tumble along with that moving sand. And here's a marsh. So this is the Arcata Marsh. All of these different ecosystems exist within California. And so thinking about how that ecosystem level diversity really, even though it's community-based, it's largely determined by these differences in the abiotic factors. How much water do we get? What time of the year do we get that water? What are our temperature and precipitation profiles, and how do they interact with each other? So why is biodiversity important? Why are we even talking about it? You hear this term likely a lot now because biodiversity globally for most groups of organisms tends to be declining. And if you look locally at a place, the diversity there might be stable or potentially increasing. A lot of times that's due to the introduction of new species that are already present elsewhere, and the removal or local extinction of species that might be endemic to that area. So that would also be a global extinction. This happened on New Zealand, where maybe the bird species haven't actually, the number of bird species biodiversity-wise hasn't changed that much, but you get a drop, an extinction of many of the endemic species, but all of these new introduced species that already are found elsewhere. So globally, that leads to biodiversity decline. But in New Zealand, it's a shift in the biodiversity. And that still matters because even though you are adding new species, that won't necessarily always be positive because those species will have different interactions with the environment as non-natives that might cause declines in other groups of organisms. Like potentially those introduced birds are going to cause declines in numbers of insects because they'll be naive to this new predator. So not just why biodiversity is confusing, but why it's important overall. And when you're thinking about biodiversity, in general, we want to be thinking about species that are endemic to an area. But this still applies even when you're thinking about like a planted field where you're trying to grow crops or you're planting and managing a forest. In general, you would want to use endemic or indigenous plants, but you could still use this same information or have the same information for introduced species. So resilience. This is not necessarily the ability to just resist any kind of disturbance, but also to recover. So if there is a disease that moves through an area and you only have one species, it is likely that if that species is susceptible to that particular disease, then it'll get wiped out. So if we're thinking about, let's do forests, because that's what I know the most about. If you have a forest that has one dominant tree species like redwoods, and some inventive pathogen was able to actually infect and kill redwoods, we would see the loss of many of our coastal forests because they are dominated almost completely by redwood trees. However, if those redwoods are growing in with Sitka spruce and Douglas fir and what else would we find on the coast? Grand fir, maybe some western hemlock. Those other tree species might not be impacted by this disease. And though it would change our overall forest, many of the ecosystem services provided by that forest would still be retained. It would be different. We wouldn't have that canopy community that we have in the redwoods. We would still have some of those able to survive in those larger Doug firs and Sitka spruce. but it would change. The overall functions, like being able to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and store it long term, the ability to hold that soil in place, the ability to soak up a bunch of water, transmit it through their tissues, and evaporate it back into the atmosphere, to seed clouds and create conditions for that precipitation. All of that is still ecosystem functions that forest could provide, even though there was a change in the species composition. But if you have more biodiversity, you're more likely to be able to recover from a disturbance and to resist that disturbance in the first place. And this also leads us to redundancy. So these two terms you can separate them out, but they're kind of reliant on each other. So if we lose a species that does an important job, hopefully we have another species that can cover. So thinking about how if you have many species in an ecosystem, some of those might be performing very similar functions. So just like with the trees, each of those trees has a root system that's holding soil in place and the ability to transmit water from that soil surface up through its tissues and the ability to pull carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in that wood. So in a sense, those trees are performing somewhat redundant jobs as far as ecosystem services go. If we think about more specific services like providing habitat, some of those tree species might not grow large enough or live long enough. Like a grand fir is not going to live long enough to create the same sort of canopy habitat that a redwood would create. So we might lose some of those functions of the redwoods. However, Doug firs and Sitka spruce both make large diameter branches. Doug firs can live to be over 1,000 years old, and so that provides some redundancy in those kind of specialized functions of the redwoods. So resilience and redundancy lead to this maintenance of ecosystem function and services. So for each of those categories, if we have more tree species in that forest, we are able to be resilient and to resist potentially the effects of a fire or a disease or a drought, because we'll have some variation in our species that are able to react to those conditions differently, and hopefully some will survive. And then also redundancy is making sure that all of those jobs hopefully are still met in some way. Maybe it'll be a little bit different and organisms will have to adapt, but overall the function of that ecosystem won't be imperiled by the loss of some species, right? If we lose a keystone species, often we can lose our ecosystem function. So thinking about how more species in an environment just increases your chances to have that redundancy so that you can maintain function if there is some sort of disturbance. And food security is an ecosystem service. So that is a provisioning service that ecosystems provide, this ability for us to acquire food from them. Also the habitat ecosystem service, where we are supporting other organisms and their food sources. So if we have a diverse array of food options within an ecosystem, we are more likely to maintain some food source if there is a disturbance that might wipe out a particular food source. So if you have 5 different types of berries that many different animals in that ecosystem eat, and one of those types of berries is wiped out by some disease or doesn't survive through these particularly long drought that we have, we'll at least have 4 other berry sources that can continue to supply the other organisms that live there. And that food supply eventually makes its way back to us. So if other animals lose their food sources, we'll eventually lose our food source too. We eat plants and animals and are highly reliant on both sources to feed our global population.